Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Manufacturing Our Way to Economic Recovery. My name is Emily Mayer, Policy Associate at NCSL. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box. So feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box on your screen. To begin building some comfortability with the chat function and to also learn who is on the line today, I invite you to type in the state from which you are calling in now. At any point, please feel free to ask a question in the chat box. We may take some questions during the webinar. We will hold a formal Q&A after our presenters are finished presenting. I want to briefly mention the resources. Above the presentation, you will see a couple of tabs with one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint, as well as some other handouts. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you can read the full bio of today's speakers. You can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. Please note, not all of the speakers will have slides. For those speakers, their title slide will be displayed. If you experience technical issues, please email registration@ncsl.org, where our team is ready to assist you. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Hollings Manufacturing Extension Partnership to bring this webinar to you. In case you are not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staff of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. Our mission is to strengthen state legislatures. During this unprecedented time, NCSL is working diligently to provide information on state policies and responses related to the COVID-19 pandemic, including a new COVID-19 state legislation database. NCSL experts are tracking nearly 2,000 COVID-19 related bills within fiscal, education, elections, health, and other topic areas. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get back to why we're here today. Restrictions and shutdowns caused by the COVID-19 pandemic have created a major shock in American manufacturing supply chains and production lines. As states begin to reopen, federal and state governments are working to support manufacturers as they get back to full production, which might include pivoting products to combat the pandemic. Over the course of the next hour, our speakers will discuss the federal funding available to manufacturers, what the consequences of the pandemic mean, the sentiment among manufacturers, and actions state lawmakers are taking to support manufacturers. Joining us today as our moderator is Dr. Rob Ivester, Deputy Director of the Hollings Manufacturing Extension Partnership at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Dr. Ivester has over 20 years of experience working to support U.S. manufacturers. He will be discussing how additional federal relief funding for manufacturers is being spent in the states and how the Manufacturing Extension Partnership is supporting these efforts. Scott Paul, President of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, will then provide a big picture overview on what the pandemic may mean for American manufacturing. Following Scott, Bob Kill, President and CEO of Enterprise Minnesota, will discuss their State of Manufacturing survey and report, which captures the challenges manufacturers are currently facing. Lastly, we will be joined by Mark Trophy, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Regional and Economic Competitiveness. Mark will provide examples of how states are responding to the pandemic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ivester. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to NCSL for hosting this timely webinar. Before we dive into the impact of the pandemic on manufacturers, I want to talk a little bit about the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. At MEP, we have a broad network of centers. There's one in every single state in the United States, plus one in Puerto Rico. And across those 51 centers, Congress has appropriated to the MEP program in this fiscal year $146 million to provide assistance to manufacturers. This assistance takes many forms, and it's directed towards helping those small and medium manufacturers be competitive on the global stage of manufacturing. In addition to the $146 million of base funding, the CARES Act provided $50 million to MEP to help small manufacturers prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus epidemic. In addition to that, the CARES Act also provided cost share waiver for the supplemental funding and for the base funding. Normally, there's a one-to-one funding requirement for the MEP funding and the services that they provide. In the presence of the global pandemic for coronavirus, it's recognized that there are challenges associated with manufacturers being able to provide cost match, and so Congress has responded by waiving that cost share requirement. So that $146 million plus the additional $50 million is active and available today at the MEP centers for them to provide assistance to small and medium manufacturers throughout the United States to help them as they struggle with remaining competitive and remaining competitive in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. At this time, I'd like to move on to our first speaker, so we'll turn it over to Scott Paul. Scott, the floor is yours.
Rob, thank you very much, and it's very good to be with all of you virtually today to have what we hope will be an insightful conversation about what some of the challenges and opportunities facing American manufacturing are in the wake of this unprecedented time that we're in, both respect to public health, the economy, and the societal change that we're experiencing right now. I will focus my initial comments on a snapshot of where things are right now, some general themes also about new issues that manufacturers have come across, or perhaps old issues wrapped up in this new environment. And I'll spend just a bit of time talking about what we view are what we view as potential effective responses to this, but I'd reserve most of those for the Q&A and the dialogue that I know we will be having. If you're looking at the webinar presentation right now, you will see a graph, and if you've been looking at economic graphs over the past couple of months, you'll know that all of them look highly unusual, and manufacturing jobs is certainly not an exception to that. And one reason why this manufacturing job graph extends out to just prior to the last recession, the Great Recession that we had, is to demonstrate a couple of points. Number one is that manufacturing has obviously seen profound job loss before. Generally, it's occurred over a longer time horizon, although during the Great Recession, manufacturing job loss was also pretty sudden and very steep. The second point that I wanted to make is that you will see through this graph also that manufacturing, from a jobs perspective, was one of the very few economic sectors that didn't recover all of the jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is we lost global market share. There was increased import penetration. Obviously, manufacturers become more productive. They may choose to automate, so there may be fewer workers require. But the combination of reasons combined with a pretty persistently strong dollar, which has held down export performance, have led to suboptimal manufacturing job growth during that period of time. It's been steady, but it hasn't been spectacular. And then, obviously, there was a very steep drop during this pandemic, particularly in March, more so in April, and a recovery of maybe about 15% of those jobs back in May. But even that recovery was very uneven, and you saw some sectors where factories restarted, like in automobile production, for instance. You saw some sectors in food, in staples, where there has been pretty steady consumer demand for those. And then you've seen some sectors like plastics add jobs where there has been heightened demand because of PPEs, plexiglass, and other types of products like that. You saw declines in electronics. You saw declines in primary metals. And so it's been, even within the last month, and there's a lot of noise in these jobs reports, it's been very, very uneven in manufacturing. A couple of things that we've learned so far, knowing that the history of this, much of it has yet to be written, because we're still, I think, right in the middle of this. One is that supply chain resilience and dynamics have never been more important, and almost every manufacturer has a supply chain, and almost every manufacturer has had a supply chain that's been under stress. And so there has been new interest and newly found interest for some in examining how to make supply chains more resilient, either through having flexible manufacturing operations. I mean, redundancy is one option. It's also incredibly expensive, but also, again, looking at other techniques, management techniques that manufacturers might have to manage this. The second, I think the second lesson that manufacturers are still learning is how to respond to these new demand realities. And for instance, considering that automobiles are responsible directly and indirectly for about 1 in every 9 manufacturing jobs, what is the role that the automotive sector is going to play in future mobility and in response to this public health crisis, and how it's going to impact that? And there are likely to be some dramatic and unforeseen circumstances, and I think manufacturers are still sorting those out, because so much of the supply chain and manufacturing right now is centered around auto production, aerospace production, et cetera, et cetera. I think a third thing that manufacturers are learning and perhaps are having a slightly easier time with than other sorts of economic activity are how you ensure worker health and safety when public health is still very much an issue. And for that, workers that have, businesses that have strong relationships with their employees, where there is collaboration and where there is a worker voice, and also employers that you would consider high road employers, are having better experiences here, and they're having fewer infections, and they're able to get back to work. And so within the sector and more broadly as a sector, manufacturing has some advantages because health and safety protocols are paramount in every workplace as well. And finally, the last sort of learning that I think manufacturers have discovered from this is both collaboration, improvisation, and new markets. And many manufacturers, while there has been a super steep decline in consumer demand, for some it's been nearly 100%. For others, it's been close to that. There have been thousands of manufacturers across the country that have also pivoted to make products that are relevant in the public health response. And through that, they have found opportunities for collaboration. They've found opportunities for new markets, and new opportunities to make flexible use of their machinery and their employees that they had not before. And that's been incredibly interesting to see in this sector. Why am I talking about manufacturing other than for the fact that I am from the Alliance for American Manufacturing, and why should state policymakers be concerned about it? And it is precisely because, all things else held steady, held steady, manufacturing jobs are pretty irreplaceable from a wage perspective, from the amount of indirect economic activity that they generate, for their synergies with innovation and what that means for both universities and labs and private sector. Manufacturing is virtually unmatched for that and the type of return that it gives to states. And any state that has been able to retain more manufacturing jobs has generally had better outcomes. And as you see, the wages are better, and so that obviously helps with state budgets with public services, and with generating other types of jobs throughout value chains and then indirectly as well. And so those manufacturing jobs are incredibly important to hold on to. And for states like Indiana, Wisconsin, Oregon, Arkansas, and I could go on, they're scattered across the country. Manufacturing still plays the most significant role, or one of the most significant roles in the overall health of the state economies. And so while it may only be nationally, about 12 to 13% of our GDP, even less than that of our employment, it packs an outsized punch in terms of its impact for national economies. Now, how should policymakers think about responding to all of this? And this is, I'll pause on this slide right here and just say that there are dozens of approaches that you can consider. And when policymakers ask me, what's the one thing that would make manufacturing just take off again? And there's not a simple answer to that. But one thing that we know for sure from past efforts to rebound during economic downturns is that of all the measures that are available to state and to federal policymakers, investing in infrastructure has some of the greatest rate of return in general for states, but also in particular for manufacturing, because the amount of materials demand that it generates within manufacturing, and obviously the efficient logistics systems that it leaves that will be there for a generation or more in manufacturing as well. And look, there are lots of best practices that we have seen states do in the past related to layoff avoidance or work share programs or more direct assistance to manufacturers or leveraging procurement laws. And I'd be happy to get into any of those in the conversation that we're going to have. But for now, I'm going to bookmark all of that, and I'm going to kick the conversation over to Bob Kill with the CEO of Enterprise Minnesota. Bob?
Thank you, Scott, for the really great information on manufacturing as an industry across the country. Thanks, Rob, for your very powerful introduction of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. Enterprise Minnesota is the center for the great state of Minnesota. And to put some perspective on it, our focus is truly 100% focused on what we say helping manufacturing enterprises grow profitably. It is our mantra, and it's part of our mission, and it's based upon consistently focused on, are we providing sustainable, measurable value business results through our consulting services to help small and mid-sized manufacturers live that mantra. Put some perspective, there are 7,900 manufacturers in the state of Minnesota, spread all over the state, even though we have one metropolitan area that dominates the population. Jobs are all over, and they're vitally critical in the small rural communities. 13% of the jobs drive 16% of the payroll, consistent with the information that Scott just shared with you about the power of manufacturing. Today, I want to talk a little bit about our voice of the industry. We focus on manufacturers to help them improve, grow profitably, but we also provide the voice to our elected officials through workshops, events, visits to manufacturers. We engage with industries that are supportive of manufacturing. Economic development stakeholders are all important. We do that through, as I said, workshops and events, but we also do it through our quarterly magazine. And at the back of this presentation, you'll have an opportunity to subscribe to it. This magazine quarterly celebrates the success of manufacturing with 6 to 8 companies on a regular basis. We also do a weekly newsletter, which is kind of the newspaper for manufacturing in the state on an active basis. And then lastly, what we're going to talk about today, our state of manufacturing. It's been 12 years in doing. The first year we did it was right during the downturn, and every manufacturer was either well into the Great Depression or about to head into it. And you're going to see a trend or two that we've been tracking for these 12 years. Example of how it's been followed, both of our senators use the data on a regular basis to talk about the power of manufacturing and the challenges and opportunities. It is a phone survey of 400 minimum manufacturing executives. It's been as high as 525. And the reason for that is we want to regionalize the data, not just do it statewide. This year was affected by the pandemic. As you can see, 58% of the executive surveys were completed prior to the National Emergency Declaration on the 13th, and 42% after. And you're going to see some dramatic differences in the opinion of the folks that were interviewed. I'd also point out that Rob Autry is the founder and leader of Meeting Street Insights, a well-known public opinion research firm in Charleston, South Carolina. And he's been leading this since the beginning. It is, I think, the one and only manufacturing survey. And he always relates the fact that in a typical public opinion survey of any type, if you hit double digits of 10% responses, you're happy. This survey consistently is in the 40 to 60% of executives who will respond immediately, i.e., they take the call and go through the survey, or they schedule a call that they follow at the first call. So the response of manufacturing executives want to be heard is pretty phenomenal. Because of the differences that occurred in the opinions on the 13th, we will do the complete survey again in September of this year to see where it is 5 months after this original survey. Just a few charts to point out the trends. If you step back to 2008 and 10, that's right during that downturn that Scott talked about, and the number of jobs that became in challenge. And you can see that the confidence in their own business has gone up virtually every year, stayed above the 90s until this year, and the not confident has been down in the single digits, this year 10%. But when you step over to the chart and see that the 7% not confident doubled overnight, and we believe quite strongly that in September we're going to see even a more interesting trend to compare this to. I would point out that the survey, when you start getting the data, one of the things it does is that we really do know our manufacturing base. Our manufacturers want to be part of the survey, though it's random. So it allows us to develop services, to implement our strategies. It allows us to look at the data. We can go around the state and present the data regionally because different industries are affected by agriculture in one part of our state, mining in another. The first year we did it, I think we herded about 200 people into a room to see it. This past 2 or 3 years, we've had well over 2,000 attendees of these events as across that spectrum of industry leaders, economic development, and elected officials who really want to see what their manufacturers are saying. To me, this really complements what Scott said earlier. If you step back to 2008 and 10, you saw a very big rehiring, and you also saw a dramatic jump in revenue, profitability, and cap expenditures as there was kind of an inventory replenishment. Then it settled down and came back very strong in 17, 18, and 19. And now you see this pretty dramatic drop. The one that I particularly pay attention to, and Scott alluded to, is capital expenditures, because that's a direct hit on a supply chain, whatever your supply chain may look like. And I think we've seen other data that said that if you did this survey even today, the cap expenditures might even be down, and that is troubling within the supply chain. Thanks to the payroll protection plan that some of the manufacturers took advantage of, the pent-up demand for COVID supplies, but the real question then becomes, will that last? And I think it's vital that all of us, as focused on the manufacturing industry, pay particular attention to what takes place today. I talked about supply chain, and this chart I think is really telling on who's going to be affected most. When Scott showed those hiring statistics back in 2008-9 to today, the companies that were most dramatically affected were the very, very small manufacturers, the less than $1 million. People often ask, why $1 million? In our state, and I would guess in virtually every state in the union, about 70% of the manufacturers are less than 10 employees, and the majority of those are under 6 employees. They're very fragile during this time. They may only have one customer. It might be in the wrong industry. They may not have a succession plan. So this happens to be the group. That group and the 1 to 5 that the Manufacturing Extension Partnership that Rob's so nicely introduced earlier can really help during this time to hopefully preserve those companies and preserve those jobs. But you will notice that the jump in decrease in that small group was more dramatic than the other two groups. And let me reiterate, about 70% of the manufacturers in any one state are focused on the small companies. Now in Minnesota, during the downturn of 2008 and 9, our legislators took a proactive approach. They developed a program called the Growth Acceleration Program. We abbreviate as GAP, but it was designed to be investing in the small manufacturers to help a small rebate back to them if they were to invest in their people to keep the people on during the recovery phase. And we had a number of manufacturers that testified in front of our legislature that enabled them to keep people that without it they wouldn't have. It's been a very successful program. Over 400 Minnesota manufacturers have taken advantage of it in the past basically 10 years. When you look at this and projections going forward, again, you look at every one of those metrics, you see that the small manufacturers are the ones that see the dramatic uptick in the concern and decrease. The September survey will be very telling to draw a comparison to these. And with that, I want to thank you for attending today's call. If you'd like more details about the state of manufacturing results, it is available on the Enterprise Minnesota website or on this link. And I'd suggest that you find a way to either get the digital or written copy of the Enterprise Minnesota magazine. The stories on those manufacturers and the innovations and things they do is not tied to Minnesota. It's tied to the innovation of small, mid-sized manufacturers. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mark Trophy. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Bob. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel today with you and Rob and Scott. And thanks also to NCSL for convening this session. I was asked to talk about how states are responding, and I'll start by qualifying my remarks. Basically, I'm sharing impressions that are based on our perspective working with and talking to numerous state officials and manufacturers over the last several months. And I guess emerging from those interactions, which have been fairly intensive, as you can imagine, 2 main points I'd like to start off with. Number one is that most of the action has been on the executive branch side, the governor's office and the executive branch agencies. They have the flexibility to pivot existing programs for this purpose, to engage the ecosystem in new and responsive ways. Most state legislatures that met this year were in session when the pandemic hit, and they were consumed with dealing with plugging the huge holes in the revenue streams for the state budgets. And so most of what I'll be talking about is around the executive branch response. And the second point is we've seen a progression of issues that they've been addressing over time as the pandemic phases have progressed. In the first few months, we saw a lot of learning to coordinate with state public health agencies and emergency management agencies. And typically these are not entities within the state that economic development folks work together with in every case. And we heard lots of stories about different cultures and different rules and different programs. So there was a lot of getting to know you and a lot of determining terms of engagement around those working relationships and the coordination of the response around that. States were very concerned about the how and the when and the who, which organizations should shut down in the early stages, and then spent a lot of time trying to figure out which manufacturers should be exempt from those orders. We saw states setting up state-funded programs in two areas in particular. One was more general emergency business assistance programs to tide companies over in the short term. Incidentally, states that had taxpayer relief statutes in place that precluded them from retaining budget surpluses for a rainy day fund, we heard from them that they felt at a real disadvantage to respond in the near term. The other area where that impacted is where we saw states providing funding for small manufacturers to pivot to make the personal protective equipment, the PPE, and only a small proportion of the states stood up different state-funded programs. The who can make the PPE question was enormously complicated, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Once the CARES Act passed, we saw states helping companies get access to the PPP federal programs and to the EIDL programs and loans. And in particular, this took the shape of working with banks and banking associations to help them respond to demand that was potentially overwhelming. We also saw them work with other sources of funding that could be used for the economic response or for recovery, beyond the usual partners that economic developers work with at SBA or with the Economic Development Administration. And this would include programs like HUD and the CDBG, disaster recovery programs, even private donor funding in some states, foundation funding, and states, as time went on, got more creative at using those resources to set up relief funds, especially targeting companies that didn't get the federal relief funds. In the last couple months, as the move has happened from reacting and responding to the recovery phase now, the questions and the issues have been more around when to reopen, who to reopen, how to reopen. Economic developers and the leaders in the state have been wrestling with questions they never anticipated. How do we deal with child care centers so that folks can go back to work, their parents can go back to work? If we restrict the number of people who can go into church, churches had to set up reservation systems for going to church and urge their congregants to not sing. So all kinds of unusual situations that we've heard about. Another area that increasingly is front and center is liability concerns and striking the right balance between protecting business owners and workers from the many risks involved with reopening. I think Utah was one of the first states to pass some legislation managing the liability issues. And then two other issues that we're hearing a lot about, and I'll do a slightly deeper dive on these now. One is thinking about all the baby boomer owners of the small manufacturing companies. And the second is around the issue you've heard both Scott and Bob talk about around the PPE and disruptions in supply chains and reshoring opportunities. So on the first one, the baby boomer owners, even before the pandemic, many of the company founders were looking to retire or sell their businesses. And with COVID, the business model and the valuations are totally uncertain. And we're finding owners increasingly anxious, their retirement savings up in the air, And so we're seeing some interest in, maybe this is an opportune time to work with them to think about how to transition to new ownership, possibly employee ownership, as a preferable alternative to just closing shop and walking away and saying this hill is too steep to climb out of it, this hole is too deep. So the concern we've got is, as the federal and state and private investments that have helped many companies get through the short term start to dry up, and in the fall, when and even now, when orders, if they're not returning to their prior levels, there's some real risk that we're going to lose a lot of these companies at that point. And this is particularly true if the disruptions in supply chains continue, and then as employees, if they're nervous to return to work, or if they do return to work and they test positive, and that leads to disruptions in production while facilities or lines are closed and scrubbed down, all these things put companies at risk. So what can legislators do to help transition companies with these aging owners to these new ownership models? There was a webinar that I'll provide a link for later. The Aspen Institute hosted several weeks ago on employee ownership that had a number of very specific suggestions in there, which I'll get to in a moment. The use of layoff aversion strategies that Scott referenced that are available under the Workforce Innovations and Opportunities Act at the Labor Department, increasing public awareness and education about how to identify companies that are in a risk situation and have this kind of ownership situation, and building the support network in the states of the legal and the accounting assistance to help them get access to honest, unbiased information, business coaches, mentors. Colorado has done a really good job at building that infrastructure to help those companies considering a transition, access to funding like affordable business loans and other financing options to reduce risk, maybe favorable tax treatment for companies that do that, or even states setting purchasing targets. Those are all things that we're starting to see bubble around out there as ways to support that. And then on the PPE side and reshoring and filling in gaps in disrupted supply chains, these all represent new opportunities for companies. And we saw in states throughout the response, many companies responding saying they wanted to help. The challenge for states was that relatively fewer can actually do what is needed. And so sorting through those offers of help was a huge challenge. We heard over and over again how the FDA requirements set a really high bar. In fact, we know of at least one state that employed a retired FDA employee as a consultant to help prospective companies figure out what they needed to do. They sorted through thousands of applications and have ended up working with, in various stages, about 100 companies in the state, providing grants to some to help them make the pivot, make the capital investment necessary. And we know from experience at NIST with the supplier scouting programs over the years, it's more complex than just finding another producer who can make the product. Supply chains are built on long-standing relationships. There's cost considerations about what it takes to retool. There's quality requirements, and there's longer-term business model issues. And most companies can't afford to pivot for short-term unless it makes a longer-term business sense, business proposition. And then there was one state we heard about where manufacturers pivoted, and they were actually making, I think it was masks in this case, and the state emergency management folks said even though it met the mask met the standards, they were unwilling to pay the higher costs that the local suppliers had to charge in order to continue production. So, the disconnect that I alluded to before. The demand for PPE is likely to be up for the next couple of years at least, because obviously there's a much bigger population that will need protective equipment around masks and sanitizers and plexiglass screens, and it's going to be everywhere in workplaces and commercial venues. Similarly, demand around treatment support, vaccine production, and distribution likely to increase demand for swabs and test vials and medical glass and things of that nature. So small manufacturers are wrestling to figure out how to navigate all the uncertainty around the risk on one side and the opportunity on the other. Maybe they're rethinking lean business practices about inventory to mitigate against short-term shocks. They're still trying to be positioned for reshoring opportunities, for new supply chain production opportunities. So those are some things that anything that state legislators can do to help manage that risk and help navigate, provide information to navigate that would be most welcome. So in closing, three key issues, I think, just to restate, what can you do to recreate or to create an environment more conducive to smooth ownership transitions from founder to the next generation of leaders or the workers, so that we can minimize the loss of these manufacturing companies. Second, what opportunities do you see in the manufacturing infrastructure and ecosystem that can support companies in your state as they position themselves to go after new business and get into new supply chains and reshoring? And then last but not least, if you want to encourage workers to return to work and business owners to open and operate safely, finding the proper balance for managing that legal risk and liability will be really, really important. So on the next slide, I've just listed some resources, and I won't go through them individually, but these are some things that we have found to be particularly helpful from the State Economic Development Executives Network, a link to the webinar from the Aspen Institute, the National Governors Association, and CDFA have really good websites detailing what states are doing. The MEP National Network, Meeting the Challenge, is a listing of what the MEP centers have done in all 50 states, and it's a great resource. And last but not least, this website of N95, which I just learned about last week, and Utah and Washington State have been very involved in using this clearinghouse to manage the demand and supply around PPE. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Rob, our moderator.
All right, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Bob, and thanks, Scott. Really appreciate the hearing your wonderful thoughts. This is really exciting to hear all the information that you had to share. We're gonna open things up for questions. I'd like to encourage you to submit your questions into the audience chat window, and then with the questions that we receive there, we'll relay those to the speakers. And then while you guys get your questions together, I'll ask a couple of questions of my own of the speakers while you guys get warmed up. So Bob, I'll go back to you. You shared those survey results with me, I think about a month ago, and I found that to be really eye-opening and really interesting to look at. And I know that you've had the opportunity to share those results with some other people. Are there any stories out of your sharing those survey results that jump to mind for you of reactions that different people have had as you've shown those results?
Well, Rob, thanks for the question. And yes, it's always amazing to present these results to people who are interested in learning more about manufacturing but haven't been real close to it. And I think the most dramatic thing that's come out of it from economic development and from some elected officials is, wow, that many manufacturers are that small? That really is the database that we all deal with. And the growth acceleration program comes up a lot because it's fairly well known in our state now. But I think by breaking it down pre-March 13th to post-13th was the most dramatic way to tell the difference in the optimism of the manufacturers. The slides I shared with you had a few more details, Rob. But most people are saying, I can't wait. Well, I don't know if they can't wait till September, but they're looking forward to the September and then an open discussion that we'll bring around to compare pre-13th, after 13th, and then September. I think both Scott and Mark hit on it, that there'll be some metrics that might improve and there'll be some that might get dramatically more negative. Back to you.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, and just a point that I want to, maybe this is pointing out the obvious, but I just want to underscore this to everyone, and Bob, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but this was a survey that was coincidentally in progress and just happened to happen over that time period. And so it's by coincidence that we're able, because it was conducted over a period of 30 days, that we're able to divide it up into these two groups of responses. It wasn't planned out to be this way in advance. So fascinating to me.
Absolutely not. It's done all 12 years. It's been done in the spring, so to speak. And it just happened. I should also say that there's 15 executive focus groups going on simultaneously. They did not get held because we started to realize even when the call was going on. But interesting, one of them was also planned with our state college presidents to talk about what they're doing, and that got canceled and come back in September. So there's a lot of depth to it. We use it to develop services to help small manufacturers. It's data that fits, I think, every state in the union.
Thanks, Bob. So we have a question from the audience. The question is, well, it seems that the number of people in manufacturing has not recovered since the 2008 recession. How has overall productivity been impacted? Are we producing more products with fewer employees using technology as an advantage? Please comment. So, Scott, I'd like to go to you on that.
Yeah, thanks. And it is a good question, and it's one of these, conundrums where it depends on the data source that you're looking at. You may derive different conclusions, but here are a couple of considerations. So it is proved that it is factual that productivity has advanced. It's advanced at a relatively slow rate in manufacturing, and there is also good and substantial evidence if you look at the work of Sue Hausman at the Upjohn Institute, or Michael Mandel at the Progressive Policy Institute, or Rob Atkinson and Stephen Ezell at ITIF, that the productivity data in manufacturing is actually quite skewed and is impacted by microprocessing speeds rather than broader advances in productivity. And so the idea that automation and productivity have helped, suppress manufacturing employment while boosting output, maybe in some instances nominally correct, but it's not. It doesn't provide explanation for the relative lack of growth in manufacturing jobs. So some other metrics to consider, and I did reference these, is that we have lost global market share in most types of advanced manufacturing with that have long value chains. And so, you can look at it bilaterally, and some people do with China, but on a broader sense, we've lost that market share to China and other countries. And so as the pie has grown, we've gotten a smaller part of it. And one of the arguments that I think I like to make is that even though the factory of the future may not have as many workers in it as it certainly would have 20 or 40 years ago, it is definitely worth having, definitely worth fighting for, because there will be a value chain, and because of the ability to grow our market share with the right types of other policies to spur demand, boost competitiveness, boost exports, make sure there's fair competition, et cetera. And so it is the productivity number alone doesn't provide a complete picture of where manufacturing stands relative to where it did, say, 10, 15 years ago, or where we do globally as well.
Thanks, Scott. That was great. And, I think something that's wrapped in with that's really important is when you talk about the value of manufacturing jobs is, and there's some great analysis that comes out of the a combination of the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the Department of Commerce that leads to an estimate of the jobs impact factor of manufacturing jobs in comparison to non-manufacturing jobs. And the number changes from year to year, but consistently manufacturing comes out on top. And it's in the range of 2.4 or 2.5 of a job multiplier effect. And one of the things that I think is, so there's 2.4 or 2.5 jobs for every manufacturing job that are dependent on the value added delivered through that manufacturing job, is that as the productivity increases, the compensation level for the employees tends to increase, and then the impact on the local economy stays at that level of that job's multiplier effect. So there's an important role here for the increase in productivity in leading to a larger economic impact on the local economy. And I think Bob, maybe you might have something you want to add on what you've seen in your surveys with running salaries in manufacturing.
Thanks, Rob. Scott, those are great, I think really great comments. Automation is good. It's necessary. And it's actually creating some phenomenal careers for young people. When you think of advanced manufacturing, it's not what some people think. But, the carpal tunnel jobs, the repetitive jobs are the ones that are hard to find. And so therefore, if at all possible, automating and then retraining that person is really a great step forward. Rob mentioned salary. The last 3 years in the survey, the salaries really have changed. The hourly rates changed. And I think the other thing that's an issue is, you talk about hard to find employees. People don't necessarily live where the job is. And it's especially detrimental to greater Minnesota or any rural community in any part of the country. Because those manufacturers, when Rob talked about supporting jobs, the people that jobs that are created based on having a manufacturing, that number even goes up when you get into a small rural community, how that manufacturer. And I would relate it to if you take a manufacturer out of a small town, it's like the high school closing up. The main street goes away and those dependent jobs go away. So the salaries have risen. Automation is not replacing, it's complementing careers. And I think Mark probably sees some things on a global basis that fit into it related to reshoring.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and make a supplemental point of this multiplier effect that I think not everybody appreciates what it means, because there's a tendency to think that when you have a manufacturing job, what the multiplier effect means is that the person who has that job spends their money in the community, and that's not what it covers. That factor gets taken out. What it captures is so your barbershop, your dentist, your grocery store. Yes, the manufacturer, the employee does spend their money locally, but that gets subtracted out. What the multiplier effect means is that the manufacturing jobs make that community and that region a more desirable region to be located in. And it creates more economic activity in that region because of synergistic relationships that are outside of that employee just paying their bills. And it's when they do the categorization of the different types of jobs, manufacturing consistently comes out as having the highest multiplication factor of any job category. So Mark, what can you talk about on the global scale of this?
So the question about reshoring, and is it real or is it just a lot of hope? I think the situation has changed a lot with this pandemic. We have seen folks over the last probably 5 or more years recognize the risks of having so much of the supply chain offshore. The tsunami in Japan, I think, was a real wake-up call for folks, where they started to diversify suppliers in different places. So I think that movement was already starting, but I think now that we've really seen disruptions in our national security capabilities, in our public health capabilities. The vulnerabilities really have been exposed in a dramatic way that they haven't been before. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see at least discussions about federal incentives for selected supply chains that are deemed in the national interest to be in place to encourage it. But I just want to reiterate that it's a real challenging and complex situation, because you're talking about OEMs and well-established purchasing patterns and cost models, business models that it's not easy to get folks to change. So I don't know, Scott or Bob, you probably have other things to add to that. I'm optimistic, but it's not a silver bullet, I don't think.
Yeah, it's Scott here, and I'll just comment very briefly. I mean, there are some certainly favorable reshoring circumstances with the proviso of once demand normalizes, because I think having aggregate demand is going to be important for any manufacturer. But the United States moving ahead should have some inherent advantages in terms of energy costs. The things that we can't control, that we don't know yet, or I think things like exchange rates. I mean, relative costs keep kind of shrinking when you look at the unit labor costs or what have you. And then, as I mentioned at the outset of my comments, I think supply chain resiliency is going to be incredibly important moving forward, because while something like COVID-19 is a low probability event, it is also high impact. And unfortunately, in a lot of the surveys we've seen, the majority of manufacturers around the world, even prior to COVID-19, had experienced a high impact, low probability event. In fact, about 3/4 of them had in the previous 5 years. So this is not what you would call a 100-year flood or a 1,000-year flood. We can expect more and more of this, and thinking that business as normal can continue is going to be wishful thinking. And so, while not in every case, but I think in more cases, reshoring is going to be the option that some companies and some supply chains are looking at.
All right. I think I'll just close out with a couple of quick comments to put a cap on that. And I think that for those of you in the audience today, this is a complicated system of the supply chains and the manufacturers, your economic interests in your various states. And this concept of supply chain resilience is really going to take off. And we really need to be thinking through more carefully with the products that we purchase and consume on a daily, weekly, and annual basis. Where do they come from, and how reliably can we get the next one? So whether I'm purchasing a phone or a computer, a car, maybe a new set of tires, how much do I know about where that product comes from? And when I think about the resiliency of the system that brings me that product, how well do I understand that? And I think that product vendors and manufacturers are going to need to have better answers moving forward. And the coronavirus pandemic has really opened up people's eyes to the idea of where do things like, whether it's, toilet paper and paper towels, or, a spray bottle of a disinfectant product like Lysol, to everyday things like meat and potatoes going onto my table. Where does this stuff come from, and what does it depend on to get from where it comes from to where I need it? And local supply chains, regional supply chains have much more resilience when it comes to being able to rapidly respond and adapt what's being provided to what's needed when circumstances change due to these high impact, low probability events. And something that I've seen over the last several years is that there's a continual uptick in people's interest in these high impact, low probability events, because we're seeing more and more of them, and we're seeing these disruptions and saying, we really got to think about what our production system looks like versus what we need it to look like. And there's a wide range of policy decisions to be considered and made that are well outside the scope of what we've talked about here today. But the MEP network is working as a collective system through the MEP centers, providing services out to small and medium manufacturers. We have a lot of information to offer, well beyond what's been shared here today. How is it that manufacturers could and should make those decisions about how they source their products and therefore build their supply chains? It's something that we're keenly interested in, and we want to make sure that we provide the information that manufacturers need so that American manufacturers can make the best decisions to produce products reliably and resiliently to meet American needs. And with that, I think we'll close out. So we'd like to extend a final thank you to all of our presenters. We really appreciate the expertise that each of you were able to provide, and we also appreciate each of you in the audience coming in and listening today. Thank you so much, and thanks to NCSL for hosting this. Have a great day.